Okay, so if you're not subscribed to this channel, please subscribe and like this video. But anyways, here we go. So I've noticed when it comes to programming stuff and coding that it's probably one of the hardest and confusing jobs out there. However, if you're somebody who can actually do it, you'd be very surprised at what you can do. So here's 10 things, hopefully, that can actually make you think about what makes a really good game, and maybe based on the coding languages that you understand versus the kind of game you want to make, what should you really focus on, what should you test, and where should you really go from there. Now, the way I look at it, when you're designing games, you have gameplay, which is one, two would be the story, three would be graphics, four would be music. Now, again, this doesn't have to be in any order, but it can be whatever you want to. Five could basically be the controls, if you don't consider that the same thing as gameplay. And basically, like, you would have like animations, graphics, the sound effects, the hit detection, um, just basically customization options. Do you want to go international? The length of the game. Is there multiplayer or something like that? Or maybe it doesn't even have to have multiplayer. But basically the variety. And what's really the not just the objective of it, but what's the what are you really getting out of it if you're even going to consider throwing a price on it? What's the budget going to be? What's the all the things to think about, most likely deadlines. And probably the number one reason is the deadlines, because that's the reason why a lot of games seem to be unfinished. Before you even consider them patching stuff out years down the road, why is it that there are games out there that just seem to have that problem? And if it's not just about money, and time is money, but if you're somebody who's like making, I mean, I've played indie games that blew all my expectations. Some games I've never even heard of, without a doubt, some of the best games of all time. And yet there's people that have figured out how to program a game using some sort of physics engine. They've decided how they were going to make the game. They finalized it, put everything they wanted into it, sold it to people, made a lot of money off it, or had a positive influence on people somehow. And you'd be surprised what you can do with that kind of mindset. So if that is truthful, really what you should do is test your products out enough before you release them. Because, or even familiarize yourself with the programming that you want to do. Really draw it out, storyboard it. You know, Figure out how many people are going to be involved. Figure out what you can offer in return, because that will actually, do you want to make more than one game? If anything, what about genres that haven't been invented yet? If such a thing is still possible. I mean, you look at like visual novels or Japanese RPGs, but what about like other sort of role playing games that haven't been invented yet? What about genres that cross certain things over? You know, like if you're going for like a story, you really got to ask yourself what kind of game you want to make. If you're making like something that just want to kill some time, then you know, basically like I like how like the Asians take their approach. They usually like their visual novels and their you know Japanese RPG elements, and then you could have both multiple endings, replayability, maybe customization that happens after the game's done with the first story, but then later on they release a sequel or maybe a remaster or remake, and then they put even more stuff in it. Maybe that was supposed to be in the first version that they released, but who knows exactly how much, how many ideas people scrapped, or even though we wouldn't have this program any problem anymore, but it's like you go back to like the old Pokemon days where cartridge limitations were the problem with how they had to redesign everything. So they had to basically think, well, how do we take these designs and recontribute it into something else? So now that they have more time to rework it into something else. It really depends on the situation and the people you're with. What's the design team thinking? What are we really going to construct? And how long do we have before we can initiate it? So, something to think about. But I do think that that was the reason why a lot of games. Oh yeah, and here's another point I want to make: self-aware AI and AI limitations. Because maybe you might release something that the AI knows how to abuse, and you might want to test the coding on it before, like play test your games before releasing them. That's a really good example of what I think a lot of people would greatly understand. you know, maybe, or even play a lot of games that, you've never played before, and just kind of get a bunch of ideas that, or tropes that you've never seen, and maybe try to think about like how can you utilize it in something else, what instrument, well, like what musical instruments should you use if you're composing your own soundtracks, what kind of, recording system should you use, what kind of, how much storage space should you have, even though that's really not a problem nowadays, but, but like, what are you really thinking about doing, how should you burn your games into what piece of software or hardware, like CDs or DVDs or Blu-rays, or, mostly it's going to be storage capacity. If you're going for discs, you're probably going to want to use, obviously, Blu-rays and dual-sided dual-rays for that. But at the same time, you're probably going to want, if you're going for cartridges or something that you could just, or do both, do digital downloads. That seems to be another good idea, because like the more you put something out there, the easier it is to get, the more copies you can sell. And basically, as long as you don't try to tell people after a certain time it expires, you basically can have it as long as you paid for it, so that way, you get your money and people can still like have a copy of it, if it's not free. But if you're looking to make a profit on something, um, be a good idea. Long games are obviously better than shorter games, but of course they take longer to develop and possibly a bigger budget. Again, depends on what you're going for. But honestly, if you really have a plan set up and you meet goal expectations, you shouldn't be able to overwhelm yourself without actually knowing what to do. See, I myself have been writing a lot of scripts for some horror games and some other games, but I'm still trying to figure out how to program it. And I plan on releasing it someday, but I'm not sure. It's gonna be a game that like hopefully nobody's ever seen before. Although that's usually the problem, is everybody's hoping that the game that they're developing is going to be something, you never really know what direction it's going to go in. But it would be really interesting though to see how somebody can come up with something that hasn't been done before, and then a lot of people just like, it becomes like another cult classic or favorite by a lot of people, or just enough people can sort of look at that and say, you know what, how come I never thought of that, versus maybe what a lot of other people have done. Sometimes you really got to take a look at what everybody else has done, and then you go from there. That way you'll kind of get an idea of what to expect. But as far as programming goes, really it just comes down to trying to understand like how you want to do it and what programs to use, and really what do you want to put into it. Because after that, it's really, is your computer fast enough? Um, do you have enough time on your hands? So that way you can support that mentality. But again, this is just some temporary advice. I will be making more videos about this stuff, but hopefully right now we can sort of get an idea. You know, Programming doesn't have to be stressful. It's just trying to make sense of everything around it, where the files are stored, how much data do you really need. But again, a file can be just as big as you want, as long as you don't run out of hard drive space, really. Um, but yeah, people that know how to program, they have a gift of some kind, because they know how to make sense of some of the hardest stuff in the world, and there's always something to work on, or even, if you're somebody who's even more gifted, invent something that nobody else has done yet, and you can make even more money if that's what you're really after. Like, I mean, I love reading like these stories about people who wrote all these coding languages, and it's just like how they did it, that's always the question they get from people is, you know, what really made you want to write that? Like what made you just realize, hey, you know what, there is another way to code this stuff, and it can be even simpler than what we already have out on the market. So it's very interesting, actually, how one person can really change the whole scenery. Somebody just comes in, looks at it, and it's like, hey, you know what? We haven't done this yet. And it's just some wild stuff that other people are able to create their own stuff because of that one person, A bunch of people inspiring other people. So, something to think about. But yeah. So if it's any advice I could really offer, it's, customizations are probably the most important. But as far as the game goes, though, if you're really looking to, make a fun game, or you want people to like really remember it, really put a lot of time and effort into it in your heart and soul, because if you don't, then it's really just like it could be a lot better is basically it. And that's usually the one thing people want, is something that's going to make them appreciate it even years down the line, because that will definitely go to show what somebody did versus what they haven't done yet.